You think this dumb mediocrity is good enough in my house? The slap came next, sharp, shocking, echoing through the marble hall like thunder. And just like that, silence. Grace Miller didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She only looked at him, the man who'd just struck her, with eyes that saw straight through the storm in his chest. Jonathan Hale, millionaire CEO, the man who ruled with fear and flawless control, had just crossed a line even he couldn't command himself back from. But what he didn't know was that the woman standing before him, the one he'd just humiliated, was the same woman who had once saved his life. And when he discovers the truth behind that scar on her arm, the world will see that even the richest man can be bankrupt in the one thing that matters most, his soul. This is Hidden Black Echoes, where the stories of struggles are told, the rise and the voice of those the world tried to silence. If you believe no amount of money gives anyone the right to strip another of their dignity, hit like and subscribe. Because in the next few minutes, you'll see how one quiet act of forgiveness will humble a man who thought he could never fall, and remind the world that grace is stronger than power. The glass door slammed so hard, the echo rattled down the marble hall. Jonathan Hale, millionaire CEO of Hale Industries, had just come from another press conference turned disaster. Cameras had flashed, investors had whispered, and now his empire trembled beneath headlines calling him a tyrant in a suit. He loosened his tie with a snap and stormed across the living room, fury sharpening his every breath. The housekeeper and staff had vanished from sight. They knew better than to stand in his path when his temper broke loose, but one woman didn't move. At the far end of the room, Grace Miller was quietly kneeling, gathering shards of broken glass from the floor. The light from the chandelier reflected off each piece like ice. Jonathan's daughter's laughter still lingered in the air from the night before. A handful of her college friends had left food, wine, and music in their wake. The mansion looked less like a home and more like the aftermath of a storm. Jonathan's voice thundered through the silence. Who gave permission for this mess? Grace didn't look up. Miss Evelyn had guests, sir. I was just cleaning up. Her tone was soft, even respectful, but it landed wrong on his pride. He stepped closer, his shoes crunching glass underfoot. And where were you when they turned my house into a college dorm? Grace kept her head lowered. I was here, sir. I tried to keep things under control, but what? His voice cracked like a whip. You work here to keep this house in order, not to make excuses. She stood slowly, meeting his eyes. I did what I could, Mr. Hale. Something in her calmness enraged him further. He'd spent the whole day being humiliated, first by reporters, then by shareholders, and now by silence. The wrong word from the wrong person was enough to ignite the storm he'd been holding back. He took a step forward. You did what you could, he repeated, his tone cold, sharp, dangerous. You think that's good enough in my house? Grace opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. The slap cracked through the room like gunfire. The sound seemed to hang in the air long after his hand fell back to his side. Grace's face turned slightly with the impact, not in shock, not in fear, but in something far quieter. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just looked at him with eyes that saw straight through the man who'd just struck her. Jonathan's breathing came heavy, the reality of what he'd done crashing through his anger too late. Grace bent down again, wordless, and began collecting the broken glass that had scattered even further. Leave it, he muttered. I said leave it! But she didn't. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a rhythm of patience against his chaos. She reached for a piece beneath the coffee table, her sleeve slipping up as she stretched. And that was when Jonathan froze. A jagged scar ran from the inside of her wrist all the way up her forearm, pale, surgical, unmistakable. For a moment, his mind blanked. He'd seen that mark before. Years ago. The memory struck like lightning. A rain-soaked highway, twisted metal, flashing red lights. A woman's trembling hands pulling him out of a burning car, a flash of that same scar as she dragged him to safety. Then the sound of sirens and her disappearing before he could even speak her name. It couldn't be. Where did you get that? His voice came out smaller than he expected. Grace didn't answer. She simply rolled her sleeve back down, picked up the last shard of glass, and placed it neatly into the dustpan. Jonathan took a hesitant step closer. That scar. Accidents leave marks, she said quietly. Some fade. Some don't. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was final. He stared at her, speechless. The man who commanded boardrooms, who crushed competitors with a single phone call, suddenly couldn't find a single word. Grace straightened and carried the dustpan to the bin. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbearable. Finally, she turned towards the door. Dinner's in the oven, sir. Miss Evelyn said she'll be home late. Jonathan's throat tightened. Grace. She paused, but didn't face him. He wanted to ask, was it you? Were you the one who saved me? But the words tangled somewhere between guilt and disbelief. When she finally did look back, her eyes were calm, unreadable. You don't have to apologize, Mr. Hale, she said softly. People show who they are when they're angry. You just did. Then she walked away, her footsteps quiet against the marble floor. Jonathan stood frozen in the center of his own mansion, surrounded by the echoes of everything he'd built, and everything he'd just broken. He looked down at his hand, the same one that had struck her, and for the first time in years, he felt small. Because he knew that scar, and he knew what it had cost her to have it. Sleep refused to come. Hours after the confrontation, Jonathan Hale sat alone in his darkened study, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating beside him. The mansion was silent, save for the faint hum of the grandfather clock counting the seconds between his regrets. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, that scar. Pale, precise, unmistakable. It had been 20 years since that night, but memory didn't fade. It just waited. He ran a hand through his hair, his reflection in the window looking older than he remembered. The millionaire everyone admired, the man who lectured the world about control, was now shaking. He poured the whiskey down the drain. It burned like guilt. The rain had come down in sheets that night, 2 decades ago, long before Hale Industries became a global name. He was 26, driving too fast, too angry. Another deal gone wrong. Another investor who didn't believe in him. His pride had filled the car faster than the stormwater did. He'd been on the bridge outside Clearwater when the tires skidded. The guardrail had blurred. The world had turned sideways. Then, darkness. When he came to, there had been fire. The steering column trapped his leg. The smoke was thick enough to choke. He remembered shouting, metal twisting, the hopeless certainty that his ambition would end in a ditch. Then a voice, calm but strained. Don't move. A figure had appeared through the smoke, a woman, soaked and trembling, her hands bare. She coughed against the fumes as she forced open the door. Her arm was bleeding, torn open by glass, but she didn't stop. He remembered her face only in flashes, rain on her skin, eyes focused and fierce. She'd dragged him free, step by step, her breath ragged. When he fell unconscious again, the last thing he saw was her trying to stop the bleeding from her own arm, the long cut that would later scar her for life. When he woke up in the hospital, she was gone. No name, no number. Only a nurse's report saying an unidentified woman had pulled him from the wreck and disappeared before police arrived. He'd tried to find her once, just once, before work swallowed his life again. He hired private investigators, checked local hospitals, even called every clinic within 50 miles. No one knew her, so he buried the memory. He told himself it didn't matter who she was, only that he'd survived. And that was the first lie he built his empire on. Now, 2 decades later, the truth had walked back into his house, wearing a maid's uniform and silence. He pressed his palms to his face. The sting of shame burned hotter than the slap he'd given her. Outside the study, footsteps approached softly. "Dad?" It was Evelyn, standing in the doorway, wrapped in a sweater. He straightened quickly, forcing composure. "You should be asleep." "I heard yelling earlier," she said. Grace looked upset. Jonathan's voice faltered. I lost my temper. It won't happen again." Evelyn crossed her arms. "It shouldn't have happened at all." The word stung more than she knew. He tried to respond, but she was already turning to leave. "She's the only person in this house who actually cares," Evelyn said quietly. "Maybe that's why you can't stand her." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading up the stairs. Jonathan sat there for a long time, the silence pressing down on him like a confession he couldn't escape. He looked around his study, the polished trophies, the framed headlines, the awards engraved with his name. Each one suddenly felt smaller, like relics of a man who'd conquered everything but his own conscience. He opened his laptop, searching one more time. Clearwater crash, July 15th, 2004. Woman rescuer. No results, just like before. He exhaled sharply, running his hand over his face. "Grace Miller?" he whispered, testing the name as if saying it aloud might prove something. Could it really be her? He thought of her eyes, calm, unafraid, the same eyes that had looked through fire once. And the scar, that cursed, unforgettable scar. The clock struck midnight. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked to the kitchen where Grace's cleaning supplies were still neatly arranged. The simplicity of it all, the mop, the folded towels, the spotless counters, mocked him. He found himself whispering into the emptiness. "If it's really you, why didn't you say something?" The air answered with silence. Upstairs, Evelyn's door closed softly. Somewhere in the distance, the city lights flickered like fading stars. Jonathan leaned against the marble counter, his voice a whisper swallowed by guilt. "You saved me once, Grace, and I repaid you with a slap." The words hung there, heavy and hollow. He looked toward the servants' quarters at the far end of the hall, where a single dim light still glowed under the door. And though he wanted to knock, to apologize, to beg forgiveness, he didn't. Because the man who once thought he owned the world had finally realized there were some debts even money couldn't pay. If this moment interests you, take a second to like this video and subscribe for more stories where hearts change faster than fortunes ever could. Your support helps us keep sharing voices that deserve to be heard. Morning came, but Jonathan Hale didn't feel the sun. The mansion was quiet. the kind of quiet that carried guilt in every echo. He'd spent the night pacing, replaying that moment over and over. The look on Grace's face, the scar, the memory of the fire. Now, as light streamed through the tall windows, he heard faint movement from the kitchen. The soft clink of plates being stacked, water running in the sink. Grace was already at work, as if nothing had happened. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her. Her posture was calm, her movements precise. There was a grace in the way she folded towels, wiped surfaces, and carried on as though the world hadn't just broken her dignity the night before. He cleared his throat. "Grace." She didn't look up. "Good morning, sir." The words stung more than they should have. "We need to talk." She nodded once. "About the house or about your conscience?" Jonathan hesitated. "Both." Grace set down the dish she was holding and turned to face him. Her eyes were steady. Not angry, just tired. "Then say what you came to say." He stepped closer, struggling for words. "That night, 20 years ago. Clearwater Bridge. Do you remember it?" A pause. A flicker of something crossed her face. She dried her hands slowly. "I do." "It was you," he said quietly. "You were the one who pulled me from that wreck." Grace didn't move, didn't speak. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Jonathan's voice broke slightly. "You saved my life, and I—" He stopped, swallowing the weight of it. "And I repaid you with a slap." Grace looked at him, then really looked, and for the first time he saw what lived behind that calm. Not anger, but sorrow. "You don't have to apologize, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "You already did what men like you always do." His brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You forgot," she said simply. "You forgot the face of the person who made your second chance possible. You built an empire on a life you almost lost, and never once wondered who paid the price to save it." Jonathan's throat tightened. "Price?" Grace rolled up her sleeve again. The scar caught the sunlight, glinting like a white river across her dark skin. "I severed a tendon in my arm getting you out of that car. The doctor said I'd never work in an operating room again." He blinked. "Operating room?" "I was a nurse," she said quietly. 7 years in emergency care. One night on my way home, I saw a car crash. I stopped. Pulled you out. That scar ended my career." Jonathan staggered back a step. "You lost your job because of me?" Grace's eyes softened. "I lost more than that. My husband left. Bills piled up. I took whatever work I could find. Cleaning, cooking, anything to survive." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Grace, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," she said, not unkindly. "You never looked." The truth hit him harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. He tried to speak, but no sound came. He'd always believed money fixed things, that apologies came with checks. But standing before her, he realized nothing in his world could buy back what she'd lost. Grace turned back to the sink, her voice low but steady. "I don't hate you, Mr. Hale. I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake, for mine." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Why keep working here then? Why put yourself anywhere near me?" She rinsed the last dish and set it aside. "Because your daughter needed someone to remind her what decency looks like. I couldn't save you from who you became, but maybe I could stop her from becoming the same." Her words were a knife to the heart. He took a small step forward. "Grace, please, Tell me how to make this right." She met his eyes one last time. "Be the man I thought I was saving that night. That's all." Then she turned, gathering her coat from the hook by the door. Jonathan's voice cracked as he called after her. "Grace, wait." She paused, but didn't turn around. He took another step. "You can't just leave. I owe you everything." "You don't owe me," she said quietly. "You owe yourself the chance to change." And with that, she walked out the back door, the sound of her footsteps fading into the morning light. Jonathan stood there, the mansion around him suddenly feeling larger, emptier, a monument to everything success had taken and left hollow. He looked down at the marble floor, where a faint mark from last night's broken glass still shimmered faintly in the light. It was a scar, too, a reminder. And he knew. Some scars never fade. They just wait for you to face them. The boardroom was silent. A room built for power had never felt so heavy. Jonathan Hale stood at the head of the table, staring out over the city skyline. Below, Hale Industries' headquarters glittered like a monument to everything he'd once worshipped. Control, ambition, perfection. The board members whispered among themselves. Stock prices had dropped, media scandals piled up, and the CEO everyone once feared now looked human. At last, Robert Lang, his oldest friend and company COO, broke the silence. "Jonathan, we can manage this situation. One interview, one apology, and we'll stabilize things." Jonathan turned, his voice calm but hollow. "I don't want to stabilize anything." The room stiffened. Lang frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this company doesn't need a man like me running it anymore." The words hit like thunder. Lang pushed back in his chair. "Jonathan, you built this company." "I also built it on arrogance," Jonathan interrupted. "On the belief that I could control people the way I control numbers. But life doesn't work that way." Murmurs rippled around the table. Lang stood. "If this is about the media—" "It's not," Jonathan said quietly. "It's about a woman I hurt. A woman who once saved my life and paid the price for it." The room fell silent again. He placed an envelope on the table, his signed resignation. Effective immediately. Lang stared at him, disbelief softening into respect. "You're serious?" Jonathan nodded. "Completely." He turned toward the board, voice steady. "From this day forward, I'm redirecting 20% of Hale Industries' private fund into a new foundation, the Miller Initiative. It'll provide scholarships for medical workers injured on duty and retraining for those who can't return to practice." A gasp escaped one of the executives. "That's tens of millions of dollars." Jonathan's tone didn't waver. "I've wasted more than that buying silence and saving face. It's time that money did something real." Lang exhaled slowly. "And Grace? Does she know?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not yet." Lang studied him, then nodded. "You finally learned what power's supposed to mean, my friend." Jonathan gave a tired smile. It only took losing everything to see it. He gathered his papers, the gold pen he'd used to sign contracts worth millions. They suddenly felt meaningless in his hand. As he walked toward the door, one of the younger board members called out, "Mr. Hale, you can't just walk away from your legacy." Jonathan paused without turning back. "I'm not walking away," he said softly. "I'm fixing it." That evening, the mansion was quiet again. Evelyn sat at the piano, softly playing the song her mother used to love. Jonathan stood behind her, listening. "You really quit?" she asked, without looking up. He nodded. I had to. Evelyn kept playing. Grace told me once that real wealth isn't about what you keep. It's about what you give. He swallowed hard. She told me something like that too. She also said you're not a bad man, Evelyn continued. Just a man who forgot what good felt like. Jonathan sat beside her. Then I'll spend the rest of my life remembering. She stopped playing and turned to him. She left this morning. He frowned. Where? Evelyn smiled faintly. Didn't say. Just left a note for you. She handed him a small folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he opened it. Don't chase forgiveness. Live it. That's how you'll earn it. Grace. Jonathan stared at the words for a long time, the ink blurring as tears threatened to fall. He rose quietly and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered like fragments of his old life. Beautiful, distant, untouchable. Dad? Evelyn asked softly. Yes. Are you proud of yourself? He smiled faintly, eyes still on the skyline. Not yet. But for the first time, his voice carried something it hadn't in years: humility. 6 months later, the world had forgotten Jonathan Hale. The headlines that once praised him, feared him, mocked him, all gone. But in a quiet corner of the city, the man who'd once ruled skyscrapers now spent his mornings driving a second-hand car to places he'd never noticed before. That morning, his destination was a modest brick building on the east side, the Haven Community Health Center. He parked beside a faded mural of children holding hands and stepped out into the sunlight, clutching a small envelope. Inside, laughter and chatter filled the air. Nurses in scrubs moved between rows of folding tables where children were learning basic first aid. At the front of the room, demonstrating how to tie a bandage with gentle precision, was Grace Miller. Jonathan froze in the doorway. She looked different, lighter somehow, though the same calm still framed her every movement. The sleeve of her shirt was rolled slightly, the scar visible but no longer harsh. It looked like something healed, not something hidden. He waited until the lesson ended, until the children filed out, before stepping forward. Grace noticed him before he spoke. Mr. Hale. He hesitated. I didn't mean to interrupt. You didn't. She folded her arms, a faint smile tugging at the edge of her lips. You found me. He nodded. I've been looking for months. Her tone remained even. Why? Jonathan exhaled. To say thank you. For the first time. Properly. Grace didn't respond, but the softness in her eyes was answer enough. He looked around the small clinic, the posters, the donated supplies, the shelves of children's books beside the cots. You built all this? With help, she said. The city granted us this space. Some people believed in what we're doing. He smiled faintly. The Miller Initiative. She looked surprised. You know about that? I started it, he said quietly. In your name. Scholarships for nurses, medical retraining programs. It's not enough, but it's something. Grace regarded him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. And why my name? He swallowed. Because you lost yours trying to save mine. The silence that followed was gentle, not cold. Grace finally said, You didn't have to do that. I know, he said, but I wanted to. I needed to. She tilted her head. To ease your guilt? He smiled sadly. To ease my heart. Grace looked at him, at the man who once struck her, who once embodied everything she despised about power, but the arrogance was gone. In its place stood a man stripped bare, willing to be small. "You've changed?" she said softly. "I had to," he replied. "The man I was didn't deserve the life you gave him." For a long moment they just stood there, two people linked by pain, bound by something deeper than forgiveness. Then Grace reached into her desk and pulled out a photograph, faded, edges curling. She handed it to him. It was a picture of her years ago in a hospital uniform, standing beside her fellow nurses. Her eyes in that photo looked the same. Strong, hopeful. "I kept this to remind myself who I was before everything burned," she said. "Now I keep it to remember who I became afterward." Jonathan studied the photo. "You still help people, even after everything." Grace smiled faintly. "It's all I know how to do. Some of us carry our pain into our purpose." He nodded, eyes glistening. "And some of us are lucky enough to meet people who show us how." She met his gaze, the silence between them warm now. Jonathan reached into his coat and handed her the envelope. "For the center. No strings." She hesitated, then took it. "What's in it?" "Enough to keep it running for a few years," he said. "And maybe fund a few more scars into healing." Grace smiled gently. "You always did know how to make grand gestures." He chuckled softly. "Old habits die hard." Then his voice grew quiet. "Grace, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know I'm trying to be someone worth forgiving." She regarded him thoughtfully, then said, "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Jonathan. It's about deciding the pain doesn't own you anymore. I let go of mine a long time ago. Maybe it's time you let go of yours." He breathed out slowly, something in him finally loosening, something that had been locked tight since the night of that crash. "Thank you," he said simply. Grace nodded. "You're welcome." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "Grace?" She looked up. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly. "Once on that bridge, and again when you taught me what it means to have one." Her eyes softened. "Then do something good with it." "I intend to," he said, smiling faintly. He stepped outside into the afternoon sun, feeling its warmth for the first time in years. The world hadn't changed, only he had. As he walked away, the laughter of children drifted from the clinic behind him, bright, hopeful, alive. And in that sound, Jonathan Hale found the peace he'd been chasing his whole life. If stories like this remind you that true strength isn't in power, but in compassion, hit like and subscribe, so you never miss the next story where pride breaks, hearts heal, and dignity finds its voice again.